Okay, so in order to put Isaiah onto our timeline, we need to zoom in on a part of our timeline to see a little bit more detail. Now, this is what we've got here. You can imagine just before here is the period of the judges. And what happened is the nation of Israel, the Israelites, were looking around at the other nations and they were saying, well, they've got kings, we want kings. And they had forgotten that God was their king. Eventually, God said, fine, you can have a human king. And the very first king was King Saul. We know a little bit about that story, and we know that King David was the next king after Saul. And after David, his son, King Solomon, was the next king. And then this is where things went a little bit wrong. And you can see that our kingdom divides into two. And this was because Solomon's son, Rehoboam, did not make very wise choices, and he was not a very good king. The people underneath Solomon had had a heavy load. And when Solomon passed away and died, they approached Rehoboam and they said, please, will you lighten our load? Will you ease the burden? And he basically said, no, I'm going to make it even harder. I'm not going to make your lives very nice. So you can imagine that if you were in the nation of Israel at that time, you wouldn't want to be serving a king like that who did not have your interests at heart. And what happened is the kingdom split in two. 10 of the tribes became the northern kingdom and 2 of the tribes became the southern kingdom. Now in the northern kingdom, they said, do you know what? We are not going to be ruled by Rehoboam. He's not going to be our king. We'll appoint our own king. And they appointed Jeroboam. Now Jeroboam was Solomon's servant. So Jeroboam was the king of the northern kingdom, which became known as Israel, and their capital was Samaria. After Jeroboam, who was an evil king, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, there were a further 18 more kings who all did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So you can see across the line for Israel in the northern kingdom, they had 19 kings in total, none of whom honoured or obeyed God. And eventually that led to the Assyrians taking them off in captivity. And their king was King Sennacherib. Who knows how to say it? I don't, that's okay. In this period, there were some different prophets who tried to tell the people of Israel, turn back to God so that you will be saved. But they didn't listen. Prophets like Elijah, you'll remember he was about here with King Ahab, the prophets of Baal. You'll remember that story, we've looked at Elijah. But there were some other prophets and they were prophesying to the northern kingdom, to the people of Israel. Now, meanwhile, while that kingdom in the north was happening, in the south we had Rehoboam. They couldn't be known as Israel anymore. They became known as Judah. And they were made up of the 2 tribes of Benjamin and Judah. And their capital was Jerusalem, which is where David had his throne, which is where the temple was. We know a bit about Jerusalem from there. Now, after Rehoboam, who was not a good king, there were a further 19 kings. But this time they were a mixture of good and bad. So 11 of them did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and 8 of them honoured God in the way that they ruled. And it's to this southern kingdom, the people of Judah, that Isaiah prophesied. Now he came around about here because it was before the Assyrians had taken off the people of Israel. And Isaiah ministered as a prophet to the people of Judah, to the southern kingdom, for 40 to 60 years, which meant that he was a prophet for the equivalent of 4 different kings. So he was speaking into their lives for a long time and imploring them, turn back to God, and telling them about this future saviour that would come, who we of course know was Jesus. One of those kings around about here was King Hezekiah that we heard about in the quiz. And Hezekiah listened to Isaiah, and that's what prevented the people of Judah from being taken over by the Assyrians. However, although they listened and avoided that bad situation, we do know that they didn't listen, and eventually the Babylonians and King Nebuchadnezzar took them into exile there. And we know that after this, we had a period of about 70 years where they were in exile. We looked at Esther the other week. She came in that period. And then our timeline continues along. So you'll see we started on the blue. We've gone down to the southern kingdom. And it's this line that continues all the way to Jesus as part of our big story that we're looking at. So as always, we want to know, where can we read about these things in the Bible? Well, Isaiah very handily has his own book called Isaiah. But if you want to read about this period, then obviously a lot of this is history. This period you can read about in 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. You can read Psalms that David wrote here. Solomon, the books are Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, which is also known as Song of Solomon. So they're the books you can read about this period of history. If you're looking at the divided kingdom, it's known as the divided kingdom because it's split in two, then you'd be looking at 1 and 2 Kings, which makes sense, right? Because there were all these different kings that those books are telling us about, and also 2 Chronicles. And then dotted around, both up here and down here, we have our prophets like Isaiah, who were telling the people to turn back to God. So what's going to happen now is, in a moment, Dan's going to come and speak to us. But if you are wanting to continue investigating Isaiah, then this is the time to open up your packs and have a little look at that. You older ones, have a think. One of the things that Isaiah said was that we are like clay and God is like a potter, and like he's molding us. And I don't know if you've done anything with clay recently, but sometimes clay doesn't do what you want it to do. Sometimes you're trying to get it in a particular shape and it's not very malleable. It's not really doing it. I want you guys to have a think about what situations in your life maybe is God saying, come on guys, pull up your socks. This is how we're going to work together. And are there areas where you're resisting? Or are there areas where you're letting other people mold your life more than letting God? So that's some things to think about for us. And in the meantime, I'm going to hand back to Dan now.